are parcels that are greater than 500 acres. And I believe Rye is going to present that to us. And I think Rye just stepped out.
Back, Chelsea, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Great. Well, Rye, we look forward to hearing
Maybe she can't.
tonight.
We're trying to figure out why the owl's not picking up.
Let me
Rye,
move,
but
let me move over closer
maybe
to
we
us.
should, yeah, or
See him now.
There we go. Now you can see me really well.
Excellent.
All
Okay, well,
right.
you have the floor, Rye.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you all for being here. I know we didn't have a regularly scheduled BOC or P and Z meeting tonight, so I do appreciate having a quorum and getting these land use items or these land use code text amendments in front of you all. As Chelsea alluded to, the action that I'm presenting to the Planning and Zoning Commission tonight is a proposed resolution which would amend Title 8 of the Pickens County Code, which is our land use code, and specifically Title 8, Section 230-30H7, which deals with road and easement vacations, and Section 630-70, which is the existing GMQS exemption for large lots, and those are lots of 500 plus acres. The land use code provides that this is a two-step review with the Planning and Zoning Commission serving as the making a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners who consider it in a two-reading ordinance. The Board of County Commissioners has considered the proposed land use code text amendments at their regularly scheduled BOCC meeting. And I believe the last one was on May 14th. And at that meeting, the BOCC approved the proposed ordinance on first reading 4-1, with Commissioner Curry voting against the ordinance. So substantively, what the proposed ordinance does, and I'm going to take these in two parts, if that's okay with you, Chelsea. I'm going to talk about road vacation and easements first.
Makes sense.
The proposed ordinance eliminates the land use code application process for seeking a road vacation or a vacation of a public easement. This essentially is a procedure that allows the Board of County Commissioners to formally give up a county road. And from a state law perspective, the only way to do that is through a formal action of the Board of County Commissioners. So the current land use code application process is unusual, to say the least, with respect to the fact that there is a procedure in our land use code for vacating a public county road. Very few other counties have anything to that effect, if any. Usually, this particular procedural mechanism would be handled through a petition filed by a property or an interested party. They'd file a petition to the Board of County Commissioners requesting that the road in question be vacated or the public way be vacated. Why this is in the Pickens County Land Use Code, I do not know the answer to that. I spoke with John Ely about it recently, and he can't recall how it ended up in the land use code, but he concurred that it is a unusual thing to have in a land use code. It's also an unusual, it's unusual to have like the community development department making a recommendation on this kind of thing in general. It's usually a legal question. It's a very fact-specific inquiry into the road in question, and it doesn't feel like its inclusion in the land use code is particularly well thought out. Toward that end, in addition to that, the standard provided in the land use code for vacating a public road is different than what state law provides. The land use code provides that the Board of County Commissioners shall vacate a county road upon the showing that it does not, that vacating the road does not leave any private property cut off public right of way. The state standard for this particular act provides that the BOCC has the discretion to vacate the road, and it's not a mandatory vacation. And when I say vacation, vacating the road. So that in of itself is a reason to remove it out of the code. I suppose you could just change the code enough to make it a discretionary standard, but I do think that it makes sense to just remove it from the land use code altogether, leave it to a petition to the BOCC type of procedure. And importantly, removing this from the land use code does not deprive an interested citizen or somebody like that from a petition to vacate a public road. So there's still an avenue for people to do that, just takes it out of the realm of the land use code. And to some extent, it may make it more accessible for somebody to pursue vacating a public road, because you don't have to go through our land use code application process, pay a fee associated with that, get in the queue for a pre-application conference, and do all that kind of stuff that you got to do. As Suzanne could tell you, she's got a ton of applications in front of her right now. So to some extent, this may make it easier for people to get in the door to pursue this.
Excuse me, just
Yeah.
a minute. First, you have a ton of requests.
Not
for
road
this?
vacation.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't clear about
Everything else.
just land use code applications.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I guess I haven't been here that long, but I don't recall anybody utilizing this particular provision of the land use code to seek vacation of a public road, at least in the last 7 or 8 years. There was a point, I think back in the early 2000s, where a property owner pursued this option, but ultimately did not pursue it to completion, and abandoned that application before it reached its conclusion. So I'm not aware of this ever being utilized in a manner that resulted either in a decision to vacate a county road or a decision not to vacate a county road. It's a pretty rare provision of the land use code as far as utilization goes. That's mostly what I have to say on that. But before I move on to the GMQS exemption for large lots, I'd be happy to answer questions from any of the commissioners about this particular action or this particular aspect of the ordinance. And I did want to add one other thing. Sorry, I just thought of this. It is not unusual for staff or the attorney's office to include multiple land use code text amendment actions in the same ordinance. These subjects are they're unique from each other, no doubt. But this is typical to have multiple land use code text amendments in the same ordinance. And yeah, I just wanted to add that. So
Yeah, I appreciate you pausing, Rye, because the two subjects are pretty different. So it makes sense for the commissioners to comment and ask questions in different silos. So I guess I would welcome any commissioner comments or questions for Rye at this time. Jasmine, do you have anything you want to add?
Thank you.
Suzanne?
Could they be separated? I mean, without going through another year or wrestling with it?
could the two text amendment subjects be separated? Yes, they certainly could. So the procedure for doing that would be if, for instance, this body wanted to recommend approval of one of these actions and not recommend approval of the other action, you could make that recommendation to the BOCC. To the extent the BOCC gave me direction to pursue one or both of the actions, I could separate them out. And that was a question that one of the board members asked on May 14, is if the two items could be separated out for separate consideration. Because I think most of the board members were willing and approved of removing the road vacation statute, or I'm sorry, road vacation procedure from the land use code, but had larger high-level policy type of questions and concerns about the 500-acre GMQS exemption. So they certainly can be separated out. It would result in a further delay in the process, but there's not a major impetus for this to happen on any time frame. I'm bringing this forward now because I think it makes sense, but you know, we could always break it out if we needed to.
And my other question was, what was Commissioner Curry's issue with this?
Her concerns were not as much related to the road vacation provision, but were related to the 500-acre GMQS exemption. And they were more, and specifically, she was concerned that there may be some unintended consequences from removing the 500-acre GMQS exemption from the land use code. And I think those unintended consequences are that maybe removing this provision from removing this GMQS exemption could potentially push somebody into filing a less desirable application for a large parcel of land in Pickens County. So instead of potentially pursuing a 500-acre GMQS exemption, a property owner could pursue a 35-acre subdivision exemption or something like that, and then utilize our growth management quota system to attempt to establish development rights on each of those 35-acre parcels. So I think that was her concern, was potential for unintended consequences.
Maybe we should discuss that concern after you've had a chance to introduce the subject to us. It makes more logical sense. Does anybody, Jeffrey, do you have any, or Suzanne, do you have any other comments that are related to the road vacation proposal? Or to track it with the state statute? And the land use?
Are you, me, Suzanne? Are you
Yeah.
speaking? Yeah, no, I have nothing else right now. Thank you.
Jeffrey, do you have any comments related to the tracking of the language in our land use code with the state statute?
No, I'm holding out for 637. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and I think it makes total sense that our land use code align with the state statute on this matter. For housekeeping purposes, it seems like a good cleanup. So well presented, Ryan. Do you want to address the next thing and keep going with your presentation?
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. So the second item that I'd like to discuss and what this ordinance does relates to 63070, which does provide a GMQS exemption for large parcels of land in Pickens County. And that exemption applies to parcels that comprise 500 acres or more. The way that the code is currently drafted is on a parcel of, utilizing this exemption on a parcel of 500 acres or more, an applicant could construct a single family residence with a floor area up to 15,000 square feet, all exempt from growth management. I'll add a caveat to that 63070 itself, I believe, or maybe it's one of the tables, calls out that if a particular caucus area or there's an overlay, a zoning overlay in a particular caucus area, that maximum house size potentially limits the floor area allowed utilizing this section. So the frying pan, what's the overlay up there? 8250 or something? 5750. So up the frying pan, if somebody were to utilize this up there, that would be the max floor area for a single family residence exempt from GMQS. But in areas of the county that do not have their own zoning overlay limiting floor area to something under 15,000 square feet of floor area, that is what the exemption would allow development of a single family residence up to on per 500 acre parcel. So that's what the current GMQS exemption does. It allows development up to that size without competing in GMQS or utilizing TDRs or anything like that. You pretty much get the maximum house size in the zone district on the 500 acre parcel. So one of the reasons, or well, the reason that I believe it's a good idea to remove this provision from the code for now is that this particular GMQS exemption, I believe, is contrary to the county's overall goals of offsetting the impact of large-scale development in sensitive areas of the county. Essentially, a lot of the places in the county where this 500 acre GMQS exemption could be utilized are far away from our urban growth boundary areas. A lot of those places contain sensitive wildlife habitat, wildfire danger, and ultimately would extend the need for luxury size services out into the very rural areas of the county. So in order to serve an 8250 house or a 15,000 square foot house on a 500 acre parcel, you likely would need to extend infrastructure like electric and gas, drill a water well out there, build a lot of roads into areas like that. And our current 500 acre GMQS exemption does not, in my opinion, do a great job of siting development on those lots in the least impactful location, i.e. close to existing roads or close to existing infrastructure. The utilization of this GMQS exemption also does not provide a public benefit other than the fact that there is a 500 acre lot now, as opposed to a more dense development. And things like requiring conservation of the remainder of the 500 acres that aren't utilized in the activity envelope, or things like offsetting the impacts of that development through making commitments to the community through the types of things we obtain through GMQS are not present utilizing this exemption. And that's why it's an exemption, and I acknowledge that. And to some extent, it is to incentivize folks with large parcels of land to utilize this to engage in a less dense development, but I don't. So there's that. But ultimately, I think that parcels that could utilize this development are best served through either participation in the county's master planning process, open space preservation master plan procedure, and or bringing back this 500 acre GMQS exemption in a manner that includes some siting criteria on these larger lots that provide both protection for some of these ecologically sensitive areas, while at the same time allowing folks to achieve and utilize this GMQS exemption to incentivize less density on the landscape. So that's why the BOCC provided direction, and I should have mentioned this before, on May 14, the BOCC, in approving this on first reading, also directed staff, me mostly, to one, explore with this body the idea of what some of that criteria would look like for siting development on a 500 acre parcels or other large lots for that matter, but the way it's currently drafted is 500 acres. And two, or at some point in the future, and the BOCC didn't put a deadline on this, but to bring back some ideas to the BOCC after this provision is removed from the code, so that there is a large lot GMQS exemption available in the future that includes some better siting criteria, better conservation goals, and provides more of a public benefit other than having a large tract of land that doesn't have density on it. And it is, to your point, Suzanne, those were some of the corollary concerns that Commissioner Curry brought up, were that, maybe we do want to incentivize folks into this, and maybe this type of development isn't the worst outcome out there. And it's a legitimate policy discussion to have. My opinion is that it's best to remove this from the land use code in the short term and bring it back in the future when it's more well thought out. So it serves the goal of incentivizing people to develop in a less dense, less intensive manner on the landscape, but also considers some of these other issues, like what it would look like to locate a large house on a 500-acre parcel way far away from existing county rights of ways. What it would look like to have to build a couple miles of road through sensitive wildlife habitat and install infrastructure and utilities in that road and all that kind of thing. So that's the balance that I'd like to strike in the future. But in the meantime, the county attorney's office is recommending that we remove this provision from the land use code now. And I can say that the BOCC is certainly interested in any thoughts that this board has about what bringing something back like this ultimately could look like in the future. So, and I know there's also the growth committee is in the mix as well. And that could be part of the growth committee conversation as well, could wrap into this. My understanding is the growth committee has not specifically looked at this particular GMQS exemption, but it doesn't mean that a lot of those folks on that committee who have experience with GMQS allotments and exemptions from GMQS in particular wouldn't have some good thoughts on how to bring back a large lot exemption from GMQS that provides some additional incentive to the public and protects some of these sensitive places where these can be utilized. And I know that when Cindy Hubin brought this GMQS exemption forward, the idea was to utilize it for something like Wildcat. But of course, Wildcat ended up annexing into Snowmass, but some of the other large, and I think I can't think of any that have used them other than
I think Wildcat and the
Wexner.
no, not even the Popish property that was next to Wildcat. Are the only ones I can think of that utilize the exemption.
Okay, so anyway, that's my opinion on what you all should do, but I'd love to have a conversation about this and talk about others. Mr. Kraybacher is trying to break in here.
Yeah, that was my first question, was how frequently is this exemption used?
It sounds like what Suzanne is saying, it's been utilized twice in the past, I believe.
And those were part and parcel of the same.
The Popish piece was separated out from, I don't know the history of what, I was definitely not involved with Wildcat. So yeah, I'm not aware of any time we utilized it in more recent time. The only thing I was going to kind of add procedurally is that right in the code today, it's a growth management exemption that doesn't have, I mean, basically it can be granted administratively. If you walk in the door, I have 500 acres, you'd have to go through activity envelope, site plan review. I think that gets at some of Rye's concerns about, we're not looking at it like in a PUD where we could go, oh, let's cluster the development and, something along those lines. It's basically, here's my 500 acres. Here's where I can show you an activity envelope, presumably that could meet the code, and a site plan, and that's just, basically an administrative, public notice, but administrative review process.
And I should have, thanks Suzanne, that was a good reminder. The BOCC also would have, when they were talking about this on the 14th, expressed, I think they were surprised to hear that somebody could utilize this GMQS exemption just going through an administrative process. And the BOCC would never see the application really, unless it was appealed. I think they were interested in taking it out of an administrative approval by right and more of a special review type approval. Maybe special review isn't right, but more of a discretionary approval from the BOCC, balancing the proposed development against the county's stated goals in our land use code. So, and Commissioner Kraybacher just walked in, Chelsea, in case you couldn't see him there. So,
Yeah. Thanks to adding that to the record. All right, well, that was a good presentation on the benefits and rationale behind the proposed ordinance and background. And thanks for your comments, Suzanne. Are there any other staff comments that you want to make related to Rye's presentation, or should I welcome some commissioner discussion?
I'm okay until you have any questions for me.
Okay, thank you. All right, Jeffrey, I know you said you were holding and saving your comments for this topic. So how about we start with you and your comments? Please let us know your thoughts.
So there are going to be more observations, I think, than questions for Rod, but I do have one question at the end. So the first observation, over the past 5 years, we've seen a number of large lots come through. So not necessarily 500 acres, but generally the theme that sort of weeds through all of them is they're proposing development in greenfields rather than brownfields. They're proposing development in scenic view corridors rather than leaving barns where they are. So, and we've received referral comments from OST, AVLT over the past 5 years that generally favor conservation easements versus an ill-defined open space. And so I think as we if this is removed from the code and we look at where we go going forward, the comments that we received, again, over the past 5 years, there's a lot of activity that takes place on what's ill-defined as open space. So it could be ranching, it could be a riding arena, it could be an indoor riding arena, and we call it open space that's there to potentially be a buffer against wildlife, et cetera. When I went back and looked at memorandums from OST and AVLT, they don't believe, so specifically, the commitments made in development applications should be made through conservation easements is sort of the common theme that comes through this. And their belief that covenants can be eliminated or changed by future BOCCs. And I think, again, the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of these applications where it's not just 500-acre lots, but there's a lot of changing of hands of these large lots. And the agreements that were formally made don't necessarily translate going forward. And so I think there's been frustration and friction through land use applications when they're not part of CEs. And so to me, this conversation is how do we drive, if it's a master plan process that leads towards more conservation easements, that seems to be what we're seeing from, very well described memos from OST and AVLT. AVLT specifically said conservation easements are more appropriate and a durable tool for conserving the property's open space parcels going forward. And their belief, again, is that deed restrictions are useful tools for protecting open space and ranch land. But again, we've seen a lot of development take place, certainly over the past 5 years in open space. So I know I'm not necessarily speaking to the house size exemption, but I'm speaking to the general, what have we seen over the past couple of years in terms of applications, and without citing names. So, and my only question for you would be, in the master plan process that's described by the county, it really pushes towards open space and trails, and there's no real mention of AVLT. So I don't know if it's it seemed very county specific. So the section, I didn't bring the whole up here.
Is that the open space preservation master plan?
Yeah,
Yeah, and that is very specific.
Yeah.
Where I can speak to that, very specific to the county acquiring an
yeah,
interest
fees and interest, yeah.
in the property, whether by conservation easement or other.
It certainly does. The reality, or maybe not the reality, a practical outcome, at least for the last couple open space preservation master plan projects, AVLT has played a role in those, either through, they initially had a commitment of funds to the Sunfire Ranch project. They ultimately shifted that commitment to the county's fee acquisition of Thompson Divide Ranch up North Thompson Creek. And that was partially a desire for the county to have, and now that I think about it, and the seller of the property to make sure that a third-party conservation easement holder was involved in the TD Ranch acquisition. And they felt that AVLT was an appropriate entity for that. And then with the Moore Family Ranch, the AVLT did end up with a 15-acre view shed protection easement on the county property acquired to the west of McLean Flats Road that protects the view up Snowmass and all that. There isn't a specific call out for AVLT in our open space preservation master planning process, but we do partner with them a lot, as well as other entities around the valley utilizing that process. Notably on Moore Family Ranch, the city contributed $1 million to that acquisition. So the two-part, the open space preservation master planning process lends itself to a blend of the county and group of interested stakeholders bringing a chunk of money to the table, while at the same time, the county creating additional value through the granting of land use entitlements. Notably, this board is not part of the review procedure in the open space preservation master planning process. That doesn't have to stay that way. So.
So Chelsea, want to follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. I feel like this is sort of a rabbit hole because we're going off topic of GMQS exemptions in general in this one line item red line. So try and keep it related to the line item red line rather than broad discussions, because we're going to get that in June 6th in the presentation from the board, or the panel. So go ahead.
So to go directly to the exemption and the benefit to the large lot holder, I guess where I was trying to go is that I don't see the public benefit. There's no trail easement, there's no fishing easement, there's no conservation easement. We're giving away square footage. So we're giving away the carrot, but really get nothing in return. And I feel like when you sit through the P&Z or the BOCC meetings, they're always trying to claw back a trail easement or some other public benefit. So I have, again, through looking at the caseload over the past 5 years, see no issue with removing sort of this carrot, from the code.
Yeah, the current Community Growth Advisory Board has some discussion of making modifications to the GMQS exemptions in their section on the GMQS, but you haven't seen that presentation yet. So we can talk about that further in your suggestions, which are valid suggestions, but more related to open space and other particular things that we would want to quote unquote claw back when that comes up in the next several months, which I'm sure we'll be discussing. That's valid points, but otherwise, so Jeffrey, does that sounds like you're kind of in favor of making this red line deletion?
Yeah, again, from my reading and looking at, again, the case study over the past 5 years and just what relationship between clients and the code in terms of large lots, what we're seeing today is greenfield development rather than brownfield, more infrastructure, more roads, building, next to wildlife. So having more of a planning process seems to be okay. And removing a carrot from the large lot to be repetitive, it doesn't seem that it would disadvantage the county in any way. And with respect to Kelly's concern, I mean, she's concerned with a state provision from the 80s or 90s, which is really just subdivision. So it would be, I think she's going to bring that up at every meeting. Just, it's preemption by the state that is pro growth. So, I don't think it's necessarily relevant to the 500 lot exemption or allocation of square footage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get it. Okay. Suzanne Caskey, would you like to ask any questions or of the presenters or make any comments to discuss among the commissioners?
To make the comment that I agree with everything that Rye has said. I'm on your side. And especially with your mention of the growth committee findings that are going to be presented soon. I think those are going to possibly change a lot in what's going on in terms of growth here. And I don't think this is having these two stay on the books is consistent with what I think is going to come from them. And I think that we're going to learn a lot from them as they come forward. So.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Anything further, Suzanne?
No, thank you.
Jasmine, would you like to make any comments or questions for?
No, I agree with what Suzanne and Jeffrey and staff have recommended.
Hey, Joe, how are you doing? I don't know if you caught Rye's presentation, but you did get the packet in advance. So Joe, welcome to the meeting. Do you have any comments or questions on the proposed deletion of the large lot exemption and the GMQS exemption?
Yeah, I have a couple questions to start with, I guess. Sorry, I missed the presentation, but I did read the packet and so on the 500 acre GMQS exemption for 15,000 square foot house, is a property owner required to do anything other than get an administrative approval? In other words, does this prevent any further development of the 500 acre parcel?
The code includes a requirement for a deed restriction against further subdivision.
Okay.
So that would be granted as, required and granted as part of that approval.
So you couldn't further subdivide the property. If you can't further subdivide the property, then I guess you're stuck with just caretaker dwelling unit, accessory buildings, ag buildings on a 500 acre parcel.
Essentially, yeah, you just went through the list of, right. Against further subdivision or development of other than a single family resident, historic dwelling units, accessory structures, dwelling units or structures and infrastructure. So
Okay.
all of the things, yeah.
And how many properties do we have in the county that are over 500 acres?
That was my question too.
Like
3,
I believe.
Monastery, and Snowmass Falls Ranch.
I think there's
What is it under Crystal something branch up like Thompson Divide?
Okay, so maybe there's, yeah, because the monastery, I think,
And that's
has
a big one.
a 500 acre parcel, a 2,200 acre parcel. Snowmass Falls is 650. But that's familiar with
one-
Crystal.
Yeah, the one I was, and I don't know if the, anyway, but that's pretty substantial, probably 3,000 acres up that way.
So, has anybody thought about, I mean, it seems to be a substantial benefit to the county if there's no further subdivision on a 500 acre parcel. And, we don't know exactly what recommendations are going to get adopted by the BOCC coming out of the CGAC meetings. So, and in the meantime, I think we need to, I don't know, think about unintended consequences, so. Okay, you've taken this away, now somebody decides to go out and, okay, I'm gonna chop it up in 35-acre parcels. Still have to go through growth management, unless somebody challenges that at some point, you know, based on. That all came about, right, because of the Penobscot case, divided into 35-acre parcels. Can't stop it, Supreme Court says, no, you can't stop that, and so growth management comes in to basically control the development of those other parcels. But, I don't know, if, you know, we thought through that, or are there better tools that are gonna come up in the ultimate recommendations from the growth committee? But it just seems to me that, you know, you got a 500-acre parcel, you build a 115,000 square foot house and, you know, CDU and ag buildings. It's not a bad outcome for 500 acres, depending on, you know, what may happen in the future.
After listening to the growth committee's discussions, I think it could be a bad outcome. I mean, the amount of vehicle miles traveled, the services that are required, the emissions that are generated because of everything that goes in those big homes, the fueling, air conditioning and heating systems that go year round to protect the artwork or whatever you have, the heated everything, the air conditioning running, but you want your feet to be warm, so you have warm floors, but cool air. There.
Yeah, yes, Susanna, you're definitely saying stuff that Joe has already definitely heard, because he was one of us three that were on the committee, so I know Joe knows what you're telling him. So I agree with that, and I'm actually kind of in concurrence with Joe and his thoughts that this is not a bad outcome for a 500-acre parcel to have a 115,000 square foot house and then the rest be deed restricted. And if the growth advisory committee so recommends to delete this exemption or expresses an interest in it, then yeah, I would be in favor of it later, but I'm not so sure that now would be the right time to redline it for fear of consequences. Go ahead, Jeff.
Start thinking through, you know, the unintended consequences. Okay, I get a 500-acre parcel, I can't do the GMQS. All right, so I'm gonna chop it into what you could create, another 14 lots or something like that. Okay, now they're, you know, it's Somas Falls, for example. Okay, that's beyond pavement. That's what tier 2 that we're talking about in the growth committee. And maybe you're limited to, what is it? 2,500 square feet, 3,500 square feet or something like that in terms of being out in that zone. And then now we've got 15 houses that are, you know, 3,200 square feet out there. So I don't know. I mean, it's probably losing cause given that the BOCC's already approved this on first reading, and it seems like it's coming back to P&Z for our blessing, so it can go for final reading. Is that correct? That they've already approved this on first reading?
So the BOCC approved this on first reading 4-1. Commissioner Curry expressed a lot of the concerns that you just raised right now during first reading.
I see.
Unintended consequences, particularly somebody utilizing a 35-acre subdivision exemption type of scheme for development of some of these large lots. This 500-acre GMQS exemption potentially incentivizes somebody to utilize the 500-acre exemption in lieu of dividing the lot into 35s, potentially. But there's nothing to prevent somebody from developing any of these or dividing any of these properties utilizing 35-acre zoning now or 35-acre exemption now.
Yeah, understood, but you may have somebody who's like, I like having my 500 acres, and I just like to have a big house, and I'm willing to agree to no further subdivision.
Yep.
I don't know, I think it's just given the juxtaposition of what's happening with the growth committee and those recommendations, and, you know, just pulling this out, and who knows what's gonna happen in between, unless, you know, county decides to adopt a moratorium between, you know, the growth committee recommendations and final code amendments. You know, I mean, I could, you know, people can pivot on a dime a lot of times, especially when you're, you know, on a 500-acre parcel. And there's not that many of them, right? I mean, is the monastery gonna do this? Of course, we don't know what the monastery is gonna do, you know, so putting that aside, we're talking about basically 2 properties in the county. But anyway, I just throw those out. It's interesting that Commissioner Curry had the same comments. Kind of coming from 2 different directions, because I don't watch, you know, the BOCC meetings that often to see what they're, you know, what they're talking about. But I think that's my, you know, that's just my concern.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid concern, and you know, the BOCC as a whole, not just Commissioner Curry, did find value in having a large lot GMQS exemption available in the code. The direction that they provided to staff was to come back with criteria associated with that 500-acre GMQS exemption that addressed things like appropriate siting of development on the large lots and clustering development in a thoughtful way that did not extend infrastructure and the need for services deep into some of these parcels, like the ones you mentioned, whether
So you're talking, I mean, I think that's probably a flaw with the current code, right?
what I believe.
A special review or some other process. Not that administrative is that easy, you know, I mean, staff, I think, is pretty tough in terms of what, you know, staff does on those.
Suzanne's very tough. But the problem with the way that GMQS exemption is drafted, as I read it right now, is if you satisfy a modicum of criteria, which is basically of the acreage to do this, it allows you to utilize the exemption without providing public benefit other than what you just discussed, which is the fact that you have a 500-acre parcel that is not further chopped up, at least in the short term, your utilization of a deed restriction. And I suppose it could be as simple as changing the criteria in the land use code that says if you're going to utilize 500-acre GMQS exemption, you shall record a conservation easement that runs to the benefit of a third party or Picken County or whomever it may be, that adequately assures that somebody's not going to come in the future and wheel and deal with some future BOCC and, you know, make a deal that eviscerates the intent of the 500-acre exemption, you know?
Right, so maybe the better consideration would be to keep it with amendments to, for example, require conservation easement, to require special review, rather than just pulling it out. That would be another option.
Well, that was certainly, the BOCC was very interested on the comments that it received or it anticipates receiving from this board, because you all actually deal with land use applications on a regular basis, as opposed to the more high level discussion that's going on with the Growth Advisory Committee right now. And to look at what some of the practical effects, like potentially pushing somebody into a higher density development scheme, as opposed to utilizing this exemption, might have. Well, they were very intent on, during first reading, that if they approved this or ultimately adopted the ordinance, that staff bring back changes to the 500-acre large lot exemption, along with some siting criteria and guarantees as far as conservation outcomes in a relatively short period of time. And what I gathered that being from the BOCC's perspective was certainly before the end of the year, if not closer to the fall. And you know, if we have some motivation behind this board to establish some criteria to do that, I'm more than happy to work on criteria for that in a shorter period of time. And if it is some, you know, I think sometimes we can get stuck in the weeds when we try and come up with new criteria for some of this stuff. It might be pretty easy to come up with the criteria that makes this particular code provision works better and allows it to, you know,
Yeah, that'll
function.
allow you to have a little more control over the situation and pick it out of administrative, and maybe it's a special review to BOCC and like you say, citing requirements, conservation easement.
And if we did that, started on such a course, that could still end up being informed by growth committee findings.
Certainly. just depends on the timing of, so this is a land use code text amendment action, so it's not a zoning action, and as long as we are complying with the various requirements of the code as far as noticing and going to the BOCC, we can tweak this to make it work. I don't think it makes sense to do it a whole bunch of times. But if we removed it now, and I get direction from the BOCC to bring this back in 6 weeks or something like that, with some additional criteria, I can certainly make that happen. At that point, you will have heard the presentation from the Growth Advisory Committee on June 6th and be informed by that. I know that Chelsea and Joe and Suzanne, you've been participating on the sideline, I guess I'll say, about that, not voting in that particular deal, but are aware of what's going on with that. So you probably have some perspective to, and you've already shared that, to gauge what I'm proposing right now. I want to be really clear that I do see the benefit of having this large lot GMQS exemption in the code. I just think it could be included in the code in a better, more meaningful way. The way it reads right now is it really incentivizes somebody that really doesn't want anything to do with Picken County at all. And, there's some benefit to that. It provides your guy that comes in that has the means to develop a large scale property like this to say, you know what, I don't want anything to do with the county. And this outcome, as you said, there's some potential benefits from it. So
let me ask another question maybe for Suzanne. So if someone were to come in under the existing administrative, process for this exemption, would they have to, can they get that approval in the absence of activity envelope, site plan review?
I mean, I think,
It seemed to be strange that you could. do
yeah, I
something.
mean, I think we would say you would need to run it
Right.
at least with the activity envelope,
Right.
since the code does allow you to do just that, but I think, in order to grant it.
Yeah, without site plan.
Defining something.
Or at least activity
Uh-huh.
envelope. Because I think
So-
that would reduce the risk that between now and whenever, summer, fall, or whatever, that somebody's gonna come in, because at least, my experience has been, activity envelope process has taken 6 months, 9 months, maybe more. Just in terms of going through, the standard steps.
Getting in the queue.
Yeah, getting in the queue. So it wouldn't seem like that there'd be a big risk that, all of a sudden, they're gonna take it away, let's rush in and get an approval. Because you're gonna have to do your typical stuff, right? You're gonna have to get a survey, you're gonna have a topo, you're gonna have to figure, what kind of constraints are there in order to cite your activity envelope. So that would be my preference, frankly, is to, not just wipe it out but to, support changing the standards and keeping it.
Well, this has been good feedback from the commissioners, and I generally am in favor of not deleting it outright, just to add my comments to the pile, and to actually consider it further and let the BOCC know we want to take this issue back up and envelope it into the Community Growth Advisory Board's recommendations. And yes, it will be working itself out through that process, I think, rather than deleting it now and then bringing it back up. Leaving it on the books, I don't think is a dangerous situation for the county, seeing as how it only affects 2 parcels that we know of. But I think that we've all discussed this as among ourselves as commissioners, and now I would be happy to open this public meeting and comments on this topic to the public that has joined us today. Bonnie, I know we have one participant who would like to comment, and if there are any others, we would welcome to listen to those comments. So Bonnie, would you like to allow participants of the public to talk at this time, please?
So currently we have Mr. Bart Johnson. Go ahead, Bart.
Thank you all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. So as it turns out, I represent one of the at least identified owners, the Perry family that owns Snowmass Falls Ranch. I kind of stumbled across the fact that this was on the agenda, I guess luckily, or maybe not, depending on how my evening is going. But I guess I'd start, I have a few points I want to make, but I think the conversation you guys have just had kind of demonstrates that this is really part of a larger policy discussion that is kind of inextricably wound up with the growth advisory committee recommendations and what's likely to come out of that. We're talking about a 15,000 square foot growth management exemption that by the time the growth advisory committee stuff is done, probably won't be 15,000 square feet anymore. It will probably be something significantly less than that, which if you're talking about maybe a home of 9 or 10,000 square feet on 500 acres or more, the Snowmass Falls Ranch is 650 acres approximately. People may look at that trade-off as beneficial to the public, even skeptics about whether this is whether the county's getting a benefit. I would also, and I don't know what other properties, Joe identified the monastery properties. As you guys were talking, I've kind of been looking around on the GIS website. There are properties that are over 500 acres in addition to the ones that are identified, but I think they're ones that have already gone through development and conservation approvals. Connie Harvey's ranch, obvious example, like the Mandalay Bay or the Mandalay Ranch properties around Owl Creek that Hines owns, I think is probably an example, but and there may be others. I don't think there are any 500 acre parcels at the Frying Pan. You've got the big Crystal Ranch property that I think Suzanne mentioned in Thompson Creek next to the Anschutz property, I think, or that may even be owned by the Anschutzes as well. I'm not really sure. But anyway, there aren't that many parcels that are affected. I do think it's worth noting, though I acknowledge it's not required, that even though there are only a few owners that would be affected by this, I don't think any of them received any kind of heads up or just kind of courtesy call about something that could be pretty dramatic to property values. And the value thing is something I want to mention because at least, I try not to be a cynical type or a conspiracy theorist, but the Snowmass Falls Ranch property, the county has been interested in purchasing it and is currently working with the Wilderness Land Trust to make a revised purchase offer. And the land trust, I've been emailing with them this week about this, and they're working on an appraisal of this property. So it looks a little awkward in the timing if the county's looking to do something that will probably devalue the property at the same time it's looking to get an appraisal with the Wilderness Land Trust to maybe buy the property, which ironically I think would be totally counterproductive because the lower the Wilderness Land Trust feels like it can offer the property based on some kind of third-party appraisal, probably makes it less likely the family would be willing to sell it for that number. But I just raised that because the timing has gotten some hackles up among my client group. And again, I'm not the cynical type or the conspiracy theorist type, but you've got to appreciate that they find the timing very awkward and suspicious, especially since we've got the advisory committee process going on. It seems like this would be a natural fit for those broader policy discussions, and yet it's being siloed out and seemingly rushed. That just doesn't ring very well with my group. And then I think to me, the idea that you have to go through site plan and activity envelope approval for a project like this, where these remoter lands are heavily burdened by wildlife and wetlands and steep slopes almost inherently because there aren't that many parcels of 500 acres. The activity and envelope and site plan approval process, I think, is more meaningful maybe than it's been given it credit for on a property like this, and it can be pretty constraining and can be a pretty exhaustive process. And I guess I just conclude by saying I'll again reiterate that I think this is more appropriate for a larger policy discussion that gets intertwined with the advisory growth committee work and what's going to come out of that, or at least should be done hand in hand with what might replace it. I just think it would be more fair and kind of transparent to the landowners if they could be involved in a process where they could have some input on what's going to replace this before it goes away altogether. So thank you very much for the time and for your consideration.
Thanks for your feedback, Bart. Bonnie, are there any other members of the public?
We have a Perry on the line. If you would like to speak, you should be able to unmute now.
I'm just listening. I don't need to speak.
Okay, thank you. And that is everybody we have online tonight or in the room.
All right, well, that was helpful comments from the public. I'll turn it back and close the public part of the meeting and turn it back to the commissioners to discuss the proposed resolution that we have before us. Remember that it's two parts. And given that there is some hesitation among several of the commissioner members and in consideration of public comment, and also Rye's own willingness to sort of further this discussion of the GMQS exemption and its quote unquote unintended consequences to a later time, or to discuss it in tandem with the Community Growth Advisory Committee's recommendations, which are coming up in 2 weeks. I would like to discuss how we can carve out a recommendation a change of this resolution to send it back up to the BOCC in favor of, changing the easement vacation land use code and taking out the proposal to delete the 500 large lot exemption from GMQS. So is there a way to do that? And is that something that the rest of the commissioners would be willing to support in this meeting?
What I would propose is we just table the application for some period of time in order to, give our feedback, hear from the growth committee, and then combine it with that process.
Well, we can still do the part though that you missed earlier in the meeting, Joe, having to do with approving the text amendment for allowing regarding county approval for vacations of easements and roadways, county roads. So can we split that up, Rye, in one ordinance for the road vacation issue and then decline to approve or table the issue on the GMQS exemption?
Yes, so the P and Z can make a recommendation that the BOCC only approve one of the land use code text amendments that are on the table, or recommend tabling the whole thing or tabling a portion of it. I would note, and I don't see, and Suzanne can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see anywhere in the code that requires an applicant to go through activity envelope and site plan to use the 500 acre GMQS exemption. So maybe that's something that Suzanne and I need to work out amongst ourselves. But I don't see that as a requirement anywhere. I look at
Sorry to interrupt, but if it's not in there, then
that it's not a
how would
requirement.
you get a vested right? Because the vested right has to be a site-specific development plan. And just coming in and saying, hey, I want a 15,000 square foot house somewhere on the property. Can you really even get vesting for that? Since it's not a site-specific plan. So maybe that would kind of address the concern about somebody
That potentially could.
trying to slide in.
The GMQS exemption unto itself, right, wouldn't grant a vested right.
Right.
Okay. So is there? Well, then can we make a motion then to approve the resolution in part having to do with the first land use text code amendment? Would that work?
you know, I probably interrupt again, but I missed that part of the meeting, fortunately. But it sounds like it was fairly straightforward in that Wright feels that we need to go by the state statute and not what's in the code.
Correct.
So that seems fairly straightforward.
So I would approve, yeah, I would approve that portion of the 2-30-40 amendment, and change that criteria, and then decline to approve the remaining portion of the resolution, with the comments as we've discussed in this meeting, looking for to table this until at least
Was
6
there,
to 8 weeks from now. But
that part of the meeting, were there any other salient comments or anything about the public road vacation?
no, there's general support among all the parties present.
Okay,
And then I guess the only other thing I would add is that the land use provides that if you get a GMQS exemption to utilize a 500 acre. Sorry, if you utilize a 500 acre GMQS exemption, that approval never goes away. That never lapses. And perhaps that's a flaw in the land use code. But you can get that approval tomorrow without going through activity envelope and site plan and establishing vested rights, but still have the ability to utilize a 500 acre GMQS exemption on your property. That's what the code says at least.
so when we amended the code to put a limit on GMQS allotments, like we did that a while back. They're, you know, historically been perpetual, and
Yep.
then, well, I don't know remember what year that was, during COVID, I believe, at some point. We decided that, what, it's like 10 years, I think, was that?
Within the 5, a growth management allotment,
Growth management allotments, 5 years.
right?
Application for this exemption does not require activity envelope or site plan review. To Joe's point, that would not establish vested rights for the site-specific development proposed. But, and again, perhaps this is a flaw in the code. Somebody could submit that land use application and get it approved administratively, presumably upon a showing that they had the acreage, which seems to be really the sole criteria for this particular GMQS exemption, a demonstration that you have the available acreage to utilize it. And that administrative approval to utilize this GMQS exemption under the existing land use code never goes away. You have that, it doesn't expire. Lapse is what the code uses, but
That's something to put on the list for the amendment.
Yeah, but I don't see there being, I get it. So somebody could apply for it tomorrow and it would last forever. But again, it wouldn't be like the worst thing to have one large house on 650 acres. That's not the worst thing.
So, right, if someone were to come in and ask for that GMQS exemption in the absence of an activity envelope application, and then at that point, presumably, you know, they'd have to enter into the subdivision, the no subdivision covenant, right?
presumably. Yes, sorry, not presumably. Yes, the
Right,
criteria is yes. In order to get the approval, they'd have to report.
For just coming in and, you know, without knowing what's gonna happen in the growth advisory committee changes, okay, I'm just gonna apply for it because I can get it. But now I can't ever further subdivide my property. I don't know,
Right.
see, anyway.
I mean, we can take a straw poll, but I'm still in favor of a motion that approves the first part of the land use code amendment and tables the second to a later time, given public feedback. And generally the timing of the presentation from the Growth Advisory Committee on June 6th. So is there a motion on the floor to approve the proposed resolution outright? I haven't heard one of those yet, but I would make a motion to approve half of the proposed ordinance and decline to approve the latter half on the second topic, the GMQS, and save that for the important discussion for a later time in tandem with the rest of the recommendations from the hardworking advisory committee. So,
And so,
is there a second?
yeah, I'll second that motion. Then I have a question for Rye. So do we have to table to a time certain?
No, I mean, so you're simply not providing a recommendation to the BOCC to adopt the ordinance. I believe that then I'd have to go to the BOCC and communicate to them that you're not in favor of the ordinance as presented. And they are ultimately the decision-making body on what happens with the land use.
Sure,
text.
yeah, it's just a recommendation, but I was just thinking if there's some way we can work in, like, how long are we gonna table it for? You know, are we tabling it for 2 years? No. Are we gonna table it for, you know, a month or two after we get the growth advisory committee
Sure.
comments?
Sure.
So that, you know, it makes it a little more palatable for those who feel that, yeah, I'll be pulled out or reworked. In terms of the.
Yeah, I mean, I can bring it back whenever the BOCC provides me direction to do that. If you all are interested in considering it, that's fine. The BOCC, at least as presented previously, was let's take it out and fix it so it works better before bringing it back. Because as you said, there's only 2 properties out there that could potentially utilize this, or that's the discussion that's been had now. So there won't be any need to bring it back if these 2 properties come in and drop land use applications to utilize this between now and whatever, tomorrow. And I would just note that the public comment that you heard is from one of those property owners who are interested apparently in utilizing this 500-acre subdivision exemption or GMQS exemption. That's news to me that they want to utilize the 500-acre GMQS exemption for this property. I guess it makes sense given the acreage, but that's the public comment, the self-interested property owner, but they are totally entitled to make that comment. So.
Well, I mean, I didn't get the impression that they want to use it. I got the impression that they want to use it for
Valuation.
valuation purposes, which would give them presumably some sort of tax benefit down the road.
Presumably, I don't know.
Okay, well, then I would say we add to, and I guess I phrased it wrong. In our recommendation to the BOCC, I propose among the commissioners that we approve part of the land use code amendment and not the first, that being the first and not the latter. Joe seconded it, given time parameters of within the next 2 months. And so I would like to poll the audience then and take a vote on this motion for approval of half of the proposed ordinance or recommendation to approve half of it. All those in favor, starting with Jasmine?
No,
Your further comment before.
I have one more.
You know, we can discuss, if we get a
Yeah.
motion, we can, the motion in a second.
Definitely.
Yeah, we had a motion in a second, so I'm just curious if it would carry. So I'm in favor of it. So the next person I'm gonna ask is Suzanne.
The question I have, or clarify this for me. If we go in this direction, in which I'm inclined to go, do I understand correctly that the worst thing that can happen is that we have 2 or 3 property owners come in and say, I want to go through the administrative procedure, and therefore we could end up with 3 15,000 square foot homes that we might not have had otherwise?
It would be more, potentially more than that, because some of the properties that are over 500 acres are larger. So it could be divided into multiple 500-acre parcels. So I don't know what that exact number is, but it's not just 3 15,000 square foot houses, it's potentially something more than that.
But on the other hand,
Yeah, I don't know.
but if we didn't go with this motion as Chelsea has proposed, the worst that could happen is that we could end up having those parcels subdivided into much smaller pieces, 35-acre pieces.
Right, they would have the right to divide them into the 35s. They'd have to compete in growth management for development rights. So at the 500 acre, they get that 15,000 square feet exempt from growth management. When you create the 35s, you're having to come in and compete for the development right for each of those. But yes, they could walk into the clerk's office tomorrow and record 35-acre exemption plots.
And whether this happens or not, somebody can do that.
Right.
although they can't, if they come in the administrative approval. And the administrative approval, you still have to do an intake, right? Yes, make the request,
Right.
Get a
required
pre-app,
Application.
and how long are pre-apps taken? 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6
Something
months?
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, none of it's
So
happening.
nobody's
quickly.
gonna get in the process for a few months.
Correct.
So it seems to be a low risk. I mean,
I feel like it's low risk given the circumstances, and the alternative is that, yeah, at any given time, they can make application to subdivide into a bunch of into 35s with 3,000 square foot houses. So I feel like it's 6 or a half dozen. So back to my surveying the audience, or the polling the commissioners. Jasmine voted no. Suzanne, do you have a vote
I'll vote yes.
in favor of the motion? Jeffrey, what do you vote?
I would vote no in favor of the motion.
no,
And-
I would not favor the motion.
Yeah, okay, Jeffrey wants the red line. And I vote in favor of my own motion. Joe, you seconded it. What was your, for the record?
yes,
And I need to think.
too late, you already voted.
No, it's not.
Okay. Well, then the motion is a split vote, 2 and 2 for the record. Suzanne, yes. Chelsea, yes. Joe, yes. Oh, wait, no, so what is it? 3 to 2. So the motion carries. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm for a moment reconsidering my vote.
Well, I hate to do this to everyone, but my ride is leaving now. I have to leave. It's 8:30 where I am, so I have to jump off. And so I will cede the chair to a willing commissioner. Jeffrey, Joe, will you take over for me, please?
I will. So my other comment would be, following up what Bart says, county's trying to buy Snowmass Falls Ranch. I think that making this change now is gonna adversely impact that process. And you never know, we may end up with the county buys Snowmass Creek Ranch or Snowmass Falls Ranch, and, they get some sort of conservation easement or, whatever deduction for doing that deal. So I think that would damage that prospect. When Bart said as much.
Well, to be clear, the county's not trying to buy Snowmass Falls Ranch, so
Oh, okay.
just, sorry.
But, I'm sorry, Wilderness Workshop was trying
I
to-
believe Wilderness Workshop is trying to, Wilderness Land Shop
Sorry.
is trying to do that, but
Okay,
I don't know the specifics of that, no negotiation. The county is ancillarily involved with that, and,
got it. Okay.
Okay, so apologies, I do have to go, but for the record, I voted in favor of the motion that I made, and so if Suzanne wants to change her mind, that's fine, but that's where I am, and I apologize, but I do have to go at this point. So Joe, you have the chair. Okay, thank you, guys. Good night.
Okay, I still need clarification.
Sure.
If I vote yes on the motion that Chelsea made,
Mhm.
that removes the 500 acre exemption.
No,
No,
Well, just
there's
table
no
that
action,
decision.
no action on the 500 acre.
yeah,
Basically, then all you're approving is eliminating the vacation provision. And taking no action on the 500 acre, so it remains
If I
as
vote,
is.
if
If you vote yes,
Yeah.
that is correct.
Okay.
If you vote yes, that is,
I voted yes.
you're agreeing with Chelsea, and we're tabling the 500 acre GMQS exemption portion of it.
Yes.
Where's the gavel?
and then I'm sorry, where was Jasmine vote? I guess I'm,
Jasmine voted no.
no, okay, got it. So it's 3-2.
So the motion.
3-2.
3-2.
Okay. Got it.
Anything else?
Did we make the right decision?
I guess we'll see.
That's it?
Make a motion to adjourn and submit the
Motion dies for lack of second. Don't go anywhere. All right, all in favor? Aye.
Is there a chance?
Passes 3-3 and 1 abstain.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.